It is now a great pleasure of mine to introduce our speaker, Dr. Aneeth Kaur Hundle, who is the Han Kaur Sahota Presidential Chair of Sikh Studies at the University of California, Irvine. And prior to her appointment at Irvine, Dr. Kaur Hundle was a visiting professor at the Center for African Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. She was also an assistant professor of anthropology and critical race and ethnic studies at University of California, Merced. And she has also been a research associate at the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala in Uganda. In addition to her contributions in Sikh studies, she is completing a book manuscript entitled Insecurities of Expulsion, Race, Violence, Citizenship, and Afro-Asian Relationalities in Trans-Regional Uganda. She is working on 2 additional projects on Sikh feminist thought and Sikhs and Sikh studies in California and in the UC system. So as a reminder, we are turning to our Q&A at about 4:30 to 4:35, and we will endeavor to close the session by approximately 4:45 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. And at this time, I would like to turn the Zoom floor over to Dr. Kaur Hundle.
Thank you so much, Neilesh, for that wonderful introduction. And I wanted to thank you and all the organizers and administrative help, staff, etc., for putting together this wonderful series and for inviting me to be part of it. I know it's really difficult to logistically organize these hybrid Zoom formats, so much appreciated in terms of making it happen. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint screen, but in the meantime, I just wanted to invite folks who are in the Zoom room, if you'd like to turn on your cameras, it would be wonderful to see you all, so I have a sense of my audience, and I just love actually seeing people instead of black boxes. So I always try to invite my students or audience members on the Zoom to feel free to turn on your cameras. And I've expanded this, so hopefully everyone can see this well. And I will try to get through this within 25 minutes or so, and I'll keep track of time a bit. My presentation today is really, I'm sort of organizing it in terms of us thinking together about Sikh studies in the academy as a field and as a field information, and thinking about sort of the university and higher education more broadly, which are some of my interests. And this presentation builds on my long form piece that I believe Neilesh assigned in his class called Guru Nanak in an Era of Global Thought, in which I really think through the past, present, and future of Sikh studies. And I kind of expound in more detail and complexity where I think the field is going and what its possibilities are. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the advent of Sikh studies chair positions, especially in North America and the academy, their possibilities and challenges. And then I want to think about how we might scale Sikh studies to our current global conjuncture, which I call a university and world-making moment. And I'm sort of thinking through that thread with respect to my current research projects and also the work that I'm doing around program building in Sikh studies and thinking about the university in general. And I'll talk specifically about my experiences with building Sikh studies at UCI and tell you a little bit more about what we've been doing here. So first, in the long form piece, I go through this in much more detail, and I'm not going to now, but I'm demarcating about 4 to 5 generations of Sikh studies scholars and mapping out for myself how I'm thinking about the intellectual history of Sikh studies. And so we could think about a kind of Sikh studies project being, of course, entwined with British Empire and colonial projects and colonial epistemologies. So we can work backward if we're working within the English language to sort of colonial travel narratives and Orientalist accounts, writings by missionaries, and anthropological writing in which Sikhs are sort of taken as anthropological subjects. And in this period, we see these colonial translations of Sikhi or the Sikh tradition and the category of religion into Western secular frameworks, which a lot of Sikh studies scholars have worked on. We also see the construction and the defining of martial races, of Sikhs as martial race, right, which becomes really important to the construction of Sikh culture, race, ethnicity. And mapping the second, third generation, however we define generations and periodizations, I'm thinking about the indigenous Sikh Saba reformers in the colonial period who were in conversation with the kind of next generation of Orientalist scholars who were more liberal-minded and a little bit more sympathetic to the Sikh tradition and thinking in different ways than sort of the more early colonists and Orientalist scholars. And then moving on from there, thinking about anti-colonial intellectuals and anti-colonial intellectual thought. If we move to the third, fourth generation, we can consider post-colonial intellectuals who are emerging in the sort of post-partition, post-colonial era. Many are born in the new British India or even in East Africa and other parts of British Empire in which there's a large Sikh presence. And they're migrating to Western countries and encountering sort of the Western liberal secular university and are inhabiting the university as Sikh subjects and Sikh intellectuals and sort of trying to figure out their kind of space in there and how to frame Sikh studies. And then you have the fourth or fifth generation. Pashore Singh calls us the millennial era of scholars. And I guess I'm on the millennial cusp somewhere. But folks who are born in diasporic contexts, working primarily in English language, but also traversing global locations and thinking of themselves as informed by the post-colonial tradition, but also sort of transnational frameworks and global frameworks of thought. So that's just a quick rundown of these different generations of Sikh scholars and Sikh studies scholars. If we think about sort of the development of the field of Sikh studies institutionally, I'll be focusing a little bit more on the US, Canadian, North American context. Sikh studies in particular is largely derived from the migration and settlement of large populations of Sikh communities to the West, who ended up taking a real interest in higher education and the university system. And so uniquely, the Sikh studies in the university emerges from a community-funded endowed chair model, which emerges to support the development of the field. And really the field emerges because you have people in the communities and Sikh communities who have taken an interest in higher education and who want us the academic study of Sikhi and ideas of the Sikh religion to be available to students, particularly in places where you have a demographically large population of Sikhs. And so I think this point is really important, that there would be no Sikh studies without the efforts of the community. And we really have to give so much credit to Sikh communities and immigrant communities for pushing to bring Sikh studies into higher education in the university under tremendous constraints. And that's important to recognize because Sikhs are minoritized in multiple ways, as a religious minority, as a racialized minority. They tend to be minoritized if we think about broader framings of South Asia studies, even religious studies as well. In thinking about also the kind of political and social context that intellectual work and scholarly work is entwined with, we can say that the political violence that was happening, both with respect to intergenerational trauma with the partition, but then moving into the 1980s and 90s of Punjab, the political violence and militancy, insurgency, counterinsurgency, that has really made it very difficult to nurture more academics and scholars in the diasporic context, because all of us were growing up in that context of political turmoil. And so just even having models of Sikh intellectuals in the humanities and social sciences was really hard to find at that time. So this community-funded model of the endowed chair became especially important, therefore, in the aftermath of the '84 anti-Sikh violence that was happening in India. And so I've just created here on this slide a little list of some of the really important early positions and scholars and the institutions that they were at, both in Canada and in the US. I'm focusing on North America. The Sikh Studies Center model is more prevalent in the UK. And there's less of that chair model in the UK context, but here it's been really, really important. And so in thinking about my own trajectory, I was aware, for example, I knew about these early positions in Canada at UBC, in Calgary, and especially Professor Bashora Singh's work and Professor Harjot Obroy's work at UBC, followed by Professor Anne Murphy. And then later on, when I arrived at graduate school at Michigan, it was Professor Tom Troutman, who was a South Asia Studies scholar, who really taught me about Sikh studies and about the work of Professor Bashora Singh before he left Winter Riverside, and then Professor Mandher came later on. Hofstra University was also another place in which we saw positions starting to emerge. In the UC system, of course, Dr. Narinder Kapani had a major role to play in developing Sikh studies, both at UCSB and UCSC, Santa Cruz in global studies. And there were key figures there, including Professor Mark Juergensmeyer and Gurinder Singh Mann. And then more recently, those positions have been filled with new scholars and colleagues at UCSB and Santa Cruz. And this new position was established at UC Irvine in the UC system. So that's just giving you a sense of kind of the landscape of these chairs. And of course, there's other possibilities in the works and folks working on these initiatives. So what are some key takeaways? And a lot of this is coming from what I've learned from my colleagues and scholars working in these positions, but then also my own observations as I've been doing my own kind of reflexive study of how to navigate these positions in the university. So one, I mean, there are important sites of intellectual research and scholarly activity that are essential to growing and building the field in new disciplinary directions, right? And so they're absolutely essential to kind of the intellectual growth of the field. They become sites of further graduate training and intellectual homes for both graduate and undergraduate students to apply to and to find intellectual community if you are working in the field. They create unique opportunities for research and scholarly collaborations. They require complex coordination across communities and donors, university administrations, disciplinary departments, and homes. They allow one to build a public profile for Sikh studies. And scholars are in a position to pursue not only their individual research agendas, but also to position themselves in public scholarly roles. And to be able to respond to multiple publics. So really thinking about sort of what the public intellectual is, right, becomes really important in this field. And so Sikh studies for me, I think as a field, it's intimately connected to needing to have institutional support, not only among Sikh scholars and academics, but among all these other people in the university who may or may not be connected to Sikh studies, but who are invested in helping to bring this very minoritized field to the university and are invested in supporting it and in supporting scholars to help to build it. Another important point is that the chairs are now beginning to reflect the changing demographics and intellectual interest in the field. So in general, we're seeing more women in positions and in the field in general, and also the new kind of diasporic generation that is taking a stronger role in building Sikh studies, specifically within the chair positions. But I would say of all the younger doctoral students that I'm seeing and that I'm working with, I'm seeing so much diversity in terms of coming from working class backgrounds, from caste oppressed positions, from being LGBT Sikhs to a lot of women, right, who are interested in pursuing doctoral work. So it's really exciting to see those new kinds of openings happening in terms of graduate work. So everything that I've listed about the possibilities of the chairs, we can also look at the other side of it and think about what are some of the challenges of the chair model. And this is things that I'm kind of listing and I'm still working through and having conversations about and trying to figure out how to navigate. I'm still trying to figure all of this out, right? This is, again, as I'm saying, a kind of my own reflexive study of the university that I'm doing as I'm navigating some of this. So if we think about the chair model as already being a byproduct of exclusions in the university, right? So kind of liberal secular exclusions of the university, the kind of racism that's embedded within the university. Also, the fact that we can think about the university as a neoliberal university that is being defunded in terms of public resources, et cetera. That the kind of community donor funded model steps in, right, to create a space for Sikh studies because of these constraints of the existing university model and the form of the university. So we can say that it's a byproduct of it, but it's also possibly constitutive of the very terms of the university itself, right? It might also be reproducing those very same problems of the university that we actually might want to do away with. So one thing that I always ask myself is like, yes, the chairs have been so important that communities are supporting these positions and supporting Sikh studies and creating a space for it. But is it also in some ways inhibiting a kind of broader universalization of Sikh studies? And we also know that there's many scholars who are working in the field or who are Sikh studies adjacent who might be in other kinds of departments, right? And so how do we just make Sikh studies more available and accessible and mainstream without having it to necessarily be tied only to a chair model? And so that gets us to this larger question of what does it mean to decolonize the university and what are the strategies to get there? And Ashil Membe talks about epistemologically creating a pluriversal university and how do we forge that kind of space for it, right? And so the constant question I'm asking, this is like maybe an opening, but what else needs to be done here? Coordinating the interests of varied stakeholders and publics can be really, really challenging while you're trying to maintain your own intellectual vision, your own scholarly research agendas, right? And you have all these things that you need to do and to get done with your work. But at the same time, you're navigating a lot of different players and interests who have ideas about what Sikh studies should be and what it should look like. A key issue that has been part of, I think, the history of Sikh studies in the US and North America is that the social constructivist approaches of critical scholars working in the field of Sikh studies is often at odds with the kinds of more essentialist claims that are required when you are a minoritized group or a minoritized community living in a liberal multicultural society. So I'm always told that I need to say like Sikhs are this, right? Sikhs do this as a community. But as an anthropologist, of course, and as a critical scholar, I'm always pointing to the complexity of Sikh communities in context over space and time. And so thinking at these different scales and working at these different scales can be really challenging. The early experiments with the chairs, I think in particular, showcase that there was oftentimes a lack of understanding among people in our own communities about what exactly scholars and researchers do in the university. So there's just a lack of understanding among communities about what the university is and what our day-to-day life is as professors and what are all the very challenging demands that we have to meet and what are all the things that we have to do even to get to tenure, right? So all of that requires pedagogical work and making the university itself as an institution and higher education legible to communities that may or may not have access to it. So that's another layer of labor to this. And likewise, scholars can have difficulty with understanding or meeting the complex needs of communities with respect to their immediate demands, it's hard to operate within the structures of the university and to be able to do that community work. Relatedly, universities as institutions are not equipped to fund, support, or even resourced enough necessarily to support faculty with doing this kind of community work. And so a really great resource for me in terms of thinking about this has been Roderick Ferguson's work on the university. He talks about the university as an archiving institution in the way that it mobilizes discourses of liberal multicultural diversity, whether racial or religious, or ideas of community. And it's able to mobilize ideas, for example, of local community engagement, whether or not the university is actually able to do that kind of community work and bridge that disconnect between the university and communities. He argues that the rhetorics of the university, its archiving function itself, allow it to maintain its function in terms of institutionalizing and minoritizing these other kinds of traditions and knowledge formations that would potentially be able to push back against that. So I'll talk a little bit about Sikh Studies at UCI. The donors that I worked with are Harvinder and Asha Sahota, and I invited them to this presentation, and I really want to thank them for, as always, for their work with getting the chair established here at UCI. From what I've heard from them and what I know about the backstory about it, it was a really involved, dramatic process with lots of challenges to even get it to this place. It was established in 2017, and I applied in 2018. And we had our inaugural reception for the chair in Sikh Studies in May 2019. And what's really exciting about this position is that it's the very first chair in the US Academy, actually, in sociocultural anthropology, which is a little bit surprising because one would think anthropology would be a really important and natural place to have Sikh Studies, given the imbrication of colonial anthropology with Sikhs and Sikh Studies, right, and the Colonial Project, but then also just all the cutting edge work that anthropologists have done on Sikhs and Sikh Studies. And I'm thinking here about people like Cynthia Mahmood and Brian Keith Axel, who've done really fantastic and rigorous in-depth ethnographic research on Sikh issues and on the Sikh tradition. So what's exciting about this position is that I'm trying to bring this interdisciplinary field of Sikh Studies in conversation with anthropology, and specifically anthropological theories, methods, and disciplinary concerns. I myself am, of course, building it with respect to my own training and concerns, which are across African, South Asia, and diaspora studies, feminist studies, university studies. Those are kind of the intersections at which I work. What the chair also enables is that it allows me to recruit anthropology graduate students who have broad concerns with Punjab or Sikh studies, whether in South Asia or in a diasporic or global context, to be able to come here and do ethnographic or other kinds of methodologies in anthropology. So a question that I often get is what does it mean to do Sikh Studies, and what does it mean to do it in anthropology? And I've had to do a lot of thinking about this to figure out what exactly it is that I'm building here and how I want to think about Sikh Studies and how I want to position it with respect to a discipline like anthropology. And I would say that there have been ongoing debates within Sikh Studies and among Sikh scholars that have spanned both Punjab and the South Asian subcontinent and diasporic intellectuals in the West, where folks are trying to figure out, fix and define what the field is, and really think critically about what kind of modalities, logics, relations of power are bound up in the field, what its disciplinary theoretical focus and geographical scope should be. So, for example, should Sikh Studies be located within a Punjab studies framework? Should it be territorialized within Punjab? And if so, what Punjab is that? Is that a pre-partition Punjab? Is it a post-partition Punjab or none? Or are we thinking about a more transnational Punjab? Is there a Punjab studies that we're interested in, or a Sikh studies that we could frame more globally? Is Sikh studies a kind of deterritorialized field that is linked up with Sikh diasporas, right? Because Sikhs have always been global and diasporic, and we know that from just moving from the period of British Empire to the post-colonial period. So trying to figure out what is the scope and scale of Sikh studies has been a key orienting question, but then also what is its disciplinary focus, and what brings us all together? What is at the core of the field? And what I'm trying to do here in anthropology is obviously think about critical approaches to the field, whether or not we want to call that a critical Sikh studies. I think some of us have been talking about that, if we need the critical or not. But definitely one of my orientations is to think about how modern categories of race, religion, and culture have all shaped Sikh life worlds and Sikh past, presents, and futures, to think about decolonizing anthropology approaches, and to be really concerned with methods and methodologies, as we always are in anthropology. The working definition that I've been using in my class is that we'll approach Sikh studies as a combination of the academic study of Sikhi and its Western translation into Sikhism, framed as a spiritual, philosophical, and ethical tradition. Sikh communities or collectivities or organized around the tradition, and the always shifting and changing circumstances and possibilities of Sikh life in relation to the unfolding of context. And so that's a really wordy, broad definition, but where I think I'm going with the field of Sikh studies, and how I'm trying to position it within the kind of presence that anthropology can contend with. And I would also say that building Sikh studies with respect to anthropology requires this constant analysis of power and the archiving tendencies of the discipline, departments, and the institutions that try to fix it, domesticate it, and minoritize it. So part of my work then is that I'm trying to build counter-institutional knowledge while I am inhabiting the institution and trying to build Sikh studies with respect to anthropology, if all that makes sense. So I'm trying to keep track of time, and I'll try to move a little bit more quickly through this, since I know we want time for questions. So what do I mean by Sikh studies in an era of university and world making? Obviously, my time on arriving in higher education and in the university coincided with the rise of Trumpism in the US, coming to UCI, followed by pandemic, climate change concerns, and shifting geopolitical turns. We've been seeing a turn to increasing investments in the global South, thinking about post-American hegemony, and now with the recent Russian aggression on Ukraine, really thinking through is our post-1945 and post-Cold War world order of this kind of militarized neoliberal austerity sort of starting to shift, right, globally and geopolitically. I'm really inspired by anthropologist Deborah Thomas, who asks us what is at stake in moving away from thinking about crisis as a framework or analysis that we use. So the idea that the crisis will be over and we'll go back to something normal. But what if we move to the scale of an epochal shift when it comes to thinking about the demise of liberal modes of sovereignty? And she's also referring to US empire, of course. And what I think is really important here to think about is that liberal modes of sovereignty, of course, are rooted in world historical systems that are racialized in capitalist exploitation, roughly from 1492 onwards, if we start with the discovery of Columbus, but that they also overlap with the emergence of the Sikh tradition. And I always think about that 1492 date in contrast to Guru Nanak's birth, which begins in 1469. And so the emergence of the Sikh tradition, right, as a kind of alternative and other project of world making. So I myself am constantly thinking about the rise of illiberalism, the shift to fascism, that are weakening the substantive content of liberal democratic structures. And in the longer form piece, I talk about this idea of postmodern conservatism, the ways in which we're seeing that social media technologies, the rise of big tech and data, misinformation, conspiracy theory, living in a post-truth world, all of this is leading to this kind of epistemic anxiety in the university itself, where we don't really have anymore necessarily an epistemic baseline for truth or liberal rationality. So it's a kind of fraught moment and an important moment to be building Sikh studies. At the level of the university, in the piece I write about how there seems to be two reactions to this. On the one hand, doubling down on liberalism. I saw that with a lot of the free speech debates that were happening at the in the UC system, versus excavating post-liberalisms or even non-liberalisms. And I think of this project of excavating non-liberalism to be really important because we just don't think about that as much. And obviously here I'm pointing to the Sikh tradition, but I'm also thinking about the kind of project of worlding that's coming from anthropology, performance studies, feminist studies, ethnic studies, Black studies. Adon Getachew talks about world making in her work, where she's mapping different imaginaries of political theory and alternative global orders. And for myself, I use the Sikh tradition as an orienting point to think about the realm of the sacred and divinity, a kind of transcendental orientation that foregrounds a divine order of existence based on principles of oneness, interconnectedness, and radical equality that can make intimate, domestic, community, societal, political, geopolitical, epistemological, and ontological interventions. And Sikh studies has the potential here then to scale from interventions from the interpersonal and relationships to domestic spaces, all the way to global, planetary, and cosmological scales. And so that is sort of the way in which I'm positioning Sikh studies with respect to these larger discussions and debates that are happening in the university and in other fields at the moment. So how does that look on the ground at Sikh studies? Well, I am in the process of finishing a book. And so I'm also trying to do a lot all at the same time, including building Sikh studies at UCI. So it's a lot, but luckily my current book project and the Sikh studies work that I'm doing have been feeding each other, and there's a lot of thought going back and forth across the two. So it has actually been really exciting and inspiring to do this work. We started our Sikh feminisms group in March 2020, around the time of the pandemic. And so I think of that as a project of Sikh feminist and queer worlding. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. I'm just going through this really quickly, but I think that will be sort of where I'm going to devote my energies for the next couple of years after finishing this particular project, because that space really hasn't been built in Sikh studies, and there's so much potential for really just highlighting the work of so many young scholars who are interested, who are feminist or queer oriented, or have those kind of, who want to bring those frameworks to their research and their work. The other project I'm working on is looking at the intersections of Sikh studies and university studies. And in particular, I'm interested in the history of Sikh communities in California and their engagements with higher education, especially the UC system, but also other institutions like Stanford. we know that, for example, intellectuals in the Ghadar party were interfacing with universities, right? And we're also in conversation with grassroots farm workers, et cetera. And I'm interested in sort of mapping out this longer engagement of Sikhs and Sikh communities with higher education in general, because my own process with getting into higher education and doctoral work itself was fraught. And so for me, I need to understand this so that we could sort of build Sikh studies even more. The other work that we've been doing is just having lots of collaborations with other Sikh studies scholars, sharing our expertise and knowledge and figuring out ways in which we can share labor across institutions has been really exciting and fruitful. And then also building conversations between Sikh studies and other kinds of research clusters. In Anthro, we have 2 research clusters on interrogating South Asia diasporas and global Africa, global Blackness that our grad students have been involved with. We're beginning conversations with the Critical Kashmir Studies Network. And just in general, being in conversation with Black, Indigenous, and ethnic studies, also thinking about critical approaches to area and region. In terms of graduate seminars that I've taught or that I'm building, these are some of my classes: interrogating citizenship, Afro-Asian entanglements, race, religion, and caste, religion and secularism. And all of these are framed broadly, but teach Sikh studies content and definitely monographs by Sikh studies scholars. And so everyone who goes through our PhD program in Anthro, if they're taking classes with me, they're getting access to Sikh studies content. I wanted to mention 2 graduate students, Amrit Thiol and Thavleen Kaur, who I've worked with. I've chaired their committees or I've sat on their committees, and they're doing fantastic work in California. Amrit works on the Ghadar party histories, thinking about California in a transnational, transregional perspective. Thavleen works on hate crimes and Islamophobic and anti-Sikh violence with respect to Sikh communities, but also Sikh temples. So she's looking, for example, at hate violence in the form of graffiti on Sikh temples and the uptick of this with the war on terror and sort of Trump era nativism and white supremacy. And they're both have jobs in the CSU system, which I'm really excited about at Fresno State and Fullerton. And so we can see that as sort of the next generation of Sikh female academics in the university. And other work forthcoming, critical approaches to Punjab studies and research on the afterlives of Punjab insurgency and counterinsurgency in the 1990s with respect to the 84. Okay, so I'm almost done. I wanted to talk really quickly about the undergraduate course I'm teaching. The intro course is called Global Themes in Sikh Studies, and it's also framed in an interdisciplinary way, but with attention to anthropology. And on the slide, I've just noted that all the topics that we cover. We start with the Guru period and the emergence of the Sikh tradition, and we cover core tenets of the Sikh tradition, Sikh spirituality, ethics, philosophy. We cover the era of empire and anti-colonial resistance, partition, 84, the war on terror and Sikh experience, feminist and queer voices, and then contemporary issues, particularly around political activism and social justice that the students are really interested in. And all my classes are tied to research opportunities. So all the students learn to do research in some way, or at least put together a research proposal. And they actually really like that. And they work in groups on it, but they've come up with really great project proposals that some of them have even put together bibliographies that we're going to put on the Sikh Studies website as resources for other students who are interested in working in the field. That intro class, we started with 20 students. We're now up to 50 students taking that intro Global Themes in Sikh Studies class. And I have to say the majority of them are non-Sikh students. We have a small minority who are Sikhs, but a lot of them are Muslims and Hindu South Asian students, and then in general, the course is cross-listed with religious studies and Asian American studies, and we just have such a diversity of students here at UCI. Some of the other courses that are in development will be Sikh religion, culture, and ethnicity, and Sikh feminism. So those are forthcoming. And then we also now have UC-wide Punjabi language courses. So they have access to Punjabi language. And we're developing a Sikh studies certificate because we don't have a minor or major yet, but we're hoping to get there. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the public facing events that we've done. We have an annual lecture series in which we bring prominent players in the field of Sikh studies to talk about their research and work. And we started that last year. It was delayed with the pandemic, but we're continuing that. We've had university-wide reading groups. I am affiliated with the journal Sikh Formations as an editorial associate, and with my team of colleagues, we have now a quarterly Sikh and Punjab studies webinar in which we talk about contemporary issues in the field. And it's really oriented towards the needs of communities and the interests of Sikh and Punjabi communities. And then we've also had other kinds of events that have been responsive to current issues, like the farmers' agitations happening throughout 2020 and 2021. We had a town hall on the farmers' agitations, which was really well attended. And then we'll have other forthcoming conferences that will be tied to research and publications. So we're out of time, and I'll end there. But that's just to share with you a little bit about the kind of vision that I see for Sikh studies moving forward, and moving forward in terms of thinking about it in the UC system as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions.